and then see what caused it so we can make future space shuttle missions safer and successful.
And of course, Senator Jay Garn today, who did go up earlier, said he would go up again tomorrow. He feels that confidence.
So did Senator Glenn.
Absolutely.
And Glenn did too, that's right.
Let's
well,
hope
thank
we
you very
learn
much.
from this.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, two local companies are involved in one way or another with the Space Shuttle program. The Battelle Memorial Institute has done rather extensive research work leading up to the program. They've been instrumental in developing the heat shield tiles and some other components. Lee Henshaw of Battelle here in Columbus told us that he spoke with the company's representative down at the Cape. They are unable at this time to comment on any aspect of the accident or its cause until NASA, of course, completes its probe, which could be a very, very long time. All the data fed back from the spacecraft was put back in. It must be carefully analyzed now before they can go on. But Rockwell, the other firm with a hand in the shuttle program, declined all comment, saying only that its company's participation was so slight in the space shuttle mission that they would not advance any interviews nor discuss the tragedy, since they would, of course, only be able to speculate. The events today were so cataclysmic that it would require many anguishing hours of research to solve the mystery of the Challenger tragedy.
One of the 7 astronauts feared dead, or who rather died today, is a native Ohioan. 36-year-old Judith Resnick grew up in Akron, Ohio, and does have relatives here near Columbus. After receiving her doctorate in electrical engineering, she worked for RCA and Xerox before joining the space program. Resnick first went up in the shuttle in 1984, and she is the second female astronaut to travel into space following astronaut Sally Ride. Christa McAuliffe was my friend. Those were the words of Gail Klink, the Ohio woman who had competed with McAuliffe at one time for the honor of America's first teacher in space. Klink first met McAuliffe back in June when the pair met in Washington with more than 100 other teachers, all hoping for a ride on the shuttle. Klink teaches Spanish and English at Newark High School and returned from Florida only last night. She is understandably shaken by the tragedy, but believes just as strongly as ever before in the shuttle program.
You know, just a real bad thing that could happen. It's real unfortunate.
I find it hard to believe that it happened.
Yeah, because, I mean, nothing like that has ever happened before, so it was a shock.
It was not limited to the students at Edison either. Teacher Sheila Gossett was thinking of the crew, especially Christa McAuliffe.
It's just hard to imagine that it's happened to anyone, and when it's a teacher, I can relate to it so well because I had some friends who would have loved to have been there. And we know that it was her dream to be there, as long as the other people that were on board. So we're all in complete shock.
Governor Dick Celeste has ordered flags at all of the state facilities to be flown at half-staff in the memory of astronaut Judy Resnick of Akron and the other 6 astronauts. We have reaction now from her high school teacher. Judy was looking for a way to broaden her career as an electrical engineer when she learned that NASA was looking for trained scientists.
I've used her as a role model in terms of showing young ladies that, you know, there's a lot of opportunities available if you've got some ability in mathematics. And it is an area, and I've pulled her out and used her as an example quite frequently, and I still will.
Of course, NASA officials are already at work trying to figure out exactly what happened, what caused that explosion today. We're going to go to the newsroom now. Jim Schroeder, who watched videotape of the accident with an aeronautical engineer from Ohio State University. And Jim, did the professor have any idea as to what might have happened?
Well, Doug, Dr. Hayrani Oz does have a few theories after the watching of the tapes, and Dr. Oz is especially interested in the launches of the space shuttle because his area of expertise is space structures and how we control them. Dr. Oz has been doing research at OSU for 6 years and was teaching a class when the explosion occurred, so he didn't see what happened until he came to our newsroom. Just before the explosion, the shuttle went to full throttle.
This would be a critical moment because you're demanding the most from your propulsion system, you're demanding the most endurance from your structural system. You're going to the highest dynamic pressure and highest acceleration levels.
During the launch, Dr. Oz says the shuttle itself is riding on a time bomb, one that is on the verge of instability. And today, something pushed it over that line. And as he watched the explosion in slow motion, he thought he saw where the trouble started.
Looks like it is starting. Something funny is going on here, then it jumps over here. So definitely something went wrong at the bottom here. Then what makes it jump over here and so on, I think that might even be immaterial in that sense because it had already gone out of hand.
In Dr. Oz's opinion, a tragedy of this magnitude was statistically bound to happen. And Doug, he says there were just too many factors, computers, and again, he feels that the space shuttle, when it's on that fuselage, is just riding on a time bomb, and there is no room for error.
Tim, you know, I think we all wondered, did they die instantly, or did it come later? Did the professor have any idea?
He thought that probably had the magnitude, the explosion of a small atomic bomb, which would have killed them instantly.
All right, thank you. NASA says that it will probably take several months now to collect all of the data that might give them some insight into what the malfunction was. At the Aviation Safety Institute in Worthington, nationally recognized experts in air safety who are often consulted after plane crashes, they were watching network coverage of the explosion, and they think investigators will have more to go on because the shuttle is sending thousands of pieces of information back to NASA computers every second, and of course there was the television coverage.
The video cameras that they have that follow the shuttle up through its launch, the telescopic cameras, will allow them not only to look at what happened, but compare that with the information that the shuttle had sent back via computer. And they can put a very good package together as to what led up to the explosion itself.
We've been with a lot of school children who were watching during their class sessions, but this happened during and around the noon hour, so people were rushing to their television sets as soon as they heard what happened. Mary Ann Herman is live at Otterbein College right now.
Well, Doug, all of these Otterbein College students sitting here watching TV, and all of us have different opinions on one thing or another that happened in the news. But reaction to today's tragedy was universal. We all felt shock, and we all whispered, "Oh my God." And a few can speak for everyone.
I'm stunned. I'm shocked. I can't believe that this has happened.
You could hear a pin drop at Damon's restaurant as everyone watched what they couldn't believe they were seeing.
When they said that it has occurred, when everything seems to be going so fine.
Well, I feel terrible about it. It's really quite a shock.
My heart started to beat real hard. And I mean, it was I can't explain what a horrible feeling it is. You're just numb.
I feel so badly for the families of these people and so forth. It's just an awful thing. Something I never expected to witness, ever.
Time stood still at Sun TV. Customers stopped buying. Salespeople stopped selling. Everyone watched.
Couldn't believe the thing going up in less than 2 minutes. It exploded midair. I don't know.
It's terrible. You know, we're not experts, we're not anybody to pass judgment, but it just seems like they shouldn't send it up. They haven't had anything but problems since day one.
People just stopped and was watching the TVs and was really concerned. You could feel it in the atmosphere. You could hear a pin drop, really. It was just devastating.
You know, these Otterbein students may not remember a national tragedy like this. But earlier today, one man who is old enough to remember says he hasn't felt like this since JFK was assassinated in 1963.
Certainly has a great impact, especially on the children who were watching. Thank you, Mary Ann. And from the tragedy in the skies today to a disaster under the ground close to home. It happened near Coshocton, where a rescue recovery team is busy tonight trying to recover the body of a man killed in a drilling rig accident. Officials have not yet released his name.
With all the delays that you experienced last week, the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there? And who made the final decision to go or no go?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of of any problems at all with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, heater box, that had about a quarter of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired, and everybody, all the experts in the program, took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time.
Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Moore said all space shuttle operations have been suspended until, in his words, we get a handle on what happened today.
To look further at the shuttle explosion, we have Jerry Gray, publisher of Aerospace America, a trade journal and a longtime follower of the space program, and David Scott, a former astronaut who was commander of the Apollo 15 mission. He now heads his own research and development company specializing in the kind of rocket boosters used on the space shuttle. Let me ask each of you first, do you have any guess as to what could have caused this explosion today, Jerry Gray?
Well, we can all make a lot of guesses. From the appearance of the initial flame that went just before the explosion, there are probably only 3 possibilities that look at all real. One is that there could have been a rupture in one of the solid propellant rocket motor casings. A small flame does appear at the exit, what looks like the exit of the motor. I don't think this is too likely. Those cases are quite strong. The area in the nozzle that might have failed...
The solid propellant rockets are the two white ones, long, cigar-shaped ones on either side.
The weakest spot in those rockets is at the nozzle juncture, and the flame seems to be upstream of that. That is in the main rocket casing.
Let us look in slow motion at the moments before the explosion and have you stop it where you see what you think is the little flame. There it is still.
There it is. See that little stop now.
The little, stop it there. You mean?
Yeah. The little flame between the big rocket at the top that's flaring and the orbiter with the tail. See, there's a little tiny orange streak down there.
Yeah, and that is not meant to be there.
No, that is definitely not meant to be there. In fact, if you watch it, it pulses back and forth for a period of about a second.
Let's advance the tape now. You can see it pulsing.
Yeah, that's it. Now, stop again.
Stop.
Now, it's not likely that that is a rupture in the solid propellant casing. The other possibility is that somehow a fracture could have occurred in the propellant tank, which is right behind that.
Yeah, the solid propellant casing is the one that is burning there, and you see it on top of our picture.
Right. And below that is sort of the dull orange background is the tank itself, which contains a lot of hydrogen and oxygen.
Yeah.
It's possible that a rupture occurred in that tank, and that is a hydrogen flame. That's the hydrogen part of the tank is down there. We're still in the atmosphere, so that possibly hydrogen streaming out of that tank could have been ignited by the solid propellant flare, and the hydrogen flame burns fast, so that could have progressed back upstream to where you see that orange spot.
Now, let's advance the tape through to the explosion.
Okay. See, it's pulsing again.
Yeah.
And then it works its way around to the outside. That's due to the vortex flow around the shuttle itself, and now it just finally ignites the whole tank and goes.
Right.
Now, there's a third possibility, too, and that is that somehow something happened to one of the main shuttle engines, which were right opposite that...
That's on the shuttle itself.
On the orbiter itself.
Which were... All right. Now, before we move on to that, David Scott, looking at those pictures in slow motion, does Mr. Gray's analysis of that make sense to you?
Well, I think he's chosen some possibilities that seem rational to me.
Do you agree that that flame is out of place there, that little flame that he identified? That should not be there.
No, it shouldn't be there.
Would you care to speculate about why it would be there?
Well, I think Jerry's identified a couple of possibilities, and I think, again, the investigation team has to take a close look, because film of this sort is...
shot from miles away through telescopic lenses and everything else.
And it takes some analysis in terms of telemetry they have on the ground, the flight profile, and the other aspects which may influence such a new flame.
Now tell us about the telemetry. You mentioned this before we get on the air. Describe that. That is a stream of information coming back from many little sensors all over the spacecraft. How many of them would be recording the performance?
There are probably thousands of sensors all over the spacecraft.
And each one is sending back its own stream of information?
Pressures, temperatures, displacements, motions, and so on. And all that information is being recorded. Now, that little flame that we saw was present for almost, probably even a little more than a second. That's a very long time for telemetry. The chances are, if there was something anomalous that were recorded by any of those sensors, they will have been recorded, and NASA's analysis would be able to identify.
I mean, how often in a second are these sensors sending back information?
They're continuous information. They're either digital or analog, but they come back on a continuous basis. A trace, such as you might see on a cardiogram, is continually coming back, recording all of the events going on in many places within the engines and other places. If the explosion were caused by something that was being monitored, then it should be able to be identified from the examination of the telemetry records. If, on the other hand, it was caused by something that might have been, that wasn't being monitored, we wouldn't know.
Now, the explosion occurred. We heard the NASA ground communicator saying it's okay for full power. They slow down, don't they, because the air pressure builds up as they're approaching orbital speed. Why do they slow the power down, or they reduce power initially right there?
Well, this is the area of what we call maximum dynamic pressure, which means that the air pressure on the vehicle, because of the thickness of the air at that altitude and the speed of the vehicle through the air, creates the maximum impact pressure, if you will, on the whole system.
So they had reduced the spacecraft's own engines down to 65% or something of power.
Down to, well, a few percent.
A few percent. And they had just been given the okay for full power, and they had just throttled up to full power, or were throttling up. What does it tell you that this happened within a few seconds of that throttling up procedure?
Not much, because
it doesn't tell you much.
Well, you're in an area of transients and dynamic changes, and you could speculate that that might have been the cause. On the other hand, I don't think there's enough information here to really make.
I heard one of your colleagues, Gene Cernan, an astronaut, saying today on ABC that moment of moving from one speed to another on any engine is always a critical time. Is that? Now, does that suggest that it was possibly that your point about the spacecraft engine?
As Dave had pointed out, there are a lot of transients at that time. The increase in thrust is small. They go from, I think, 100% to 104% of thrust. So it's not a major change, but it is a change. And there can be an oscillation at that time. Now,
what does an oscillation mean?
Well,
anything, shake a bit.
Anytime you have a change means that there's got to be something happening. If that, for example, the propellant valve moves a fraction of an inch too far, there can be a slight pressure pulse. If this accident turns out to have been caused by the main engine, that's probably what happened. We don't know if that's the case, but it is one of the three major possibilities. A main engine failure could have flashed back and ignited the propellant coming out of the tank, as we saw, and caused the fire.
I see. Now, has this takeoff moment, which in any aircraft is a critical moment, and presumably even more so here because you're dealing with such volatile fuel and in such large quantities and everything, has that moment in the shuttle program been more dangerous than we, the public, always? The probabilities of risk greater than we've sort of been assuming, because they've all seemed to have gone off without any hitch. Is that a dangerous moment?
Well, I think in relative terms, the shuttle is much safer than previous spacecraft. As you probably know, there's no need or capability to abort on the pad. In other words, if you're on the launch pad within the first few seconds, I think NASA believes the shuttle is reliable enough, and I think it's been proven that you don't have to have ejection seats or other escape phenomena.
The first shuttle had ejection seats and things in it.
The first floor flights had ejection seats in order to provide an extra margin of safety for
because
the crew.
It was an untried
Sure, it was
vehicle.
a test flight. Yeah. But now we're in operational flights, and I think the shuttle is basically a very, very sound and safe vehicle. And for this particular occurrence, it's one of those statistical improbabilities that occurred.
But people like Senator Glenn, former astronaut, another former colleague, was saying today, we probably always thought that a day like this would come. Inherently, there was a range of risk, and was there not in these things? And that's a critical moment in that range.
Yes, and I would agree with Senator Glenn, because I think we've been very fortunate to have had the engineering expertise to get us to this point without a major failure. And
there's one other thing. I know this is all speculation, but you are very much better informed than we are about these things. Is it sensible to speculate, even, that the fact that there was a lot of ice buildup on the launch pad and on the spacecraft, which they had to clear off, that could have in any way contributed to this situation today?
It's, you know, anything is possible. There could have been any number of malfunctions. Possibly some insulation was damaged, causing a spark somewhere later. But the probability of that is really very, very low. The spacecraft is designed to operate in a very wide range of environments. In space, it's well below freezing. Liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, the propellants, are extremely cold. Icicles could have done some damage to pad systems. That is the, say, the cooling water system that douses the pad and keeps it from being burned. That's the launch pad. But it just doesn't seem likely that any icicles, unless they physically damaged the exterior of the vehicle, could have caused the problem. And I think NASA probably felt that way, too, since they did a final inspection before they launched.
You are an expert in the booster engines. As I was told today and wrote in introducing you, what is the record of these engines under test circumstances and in actual flight circumstances? Do they fail?
Well, I think you can see that in flight circumstances they don't, and the reliabilities are very, very high. You know, the statistical probability of failure.
We're talking now about the solid propellant engines on the outside.
Either one. I think that you might say the suite of engines that NASA has on this vehicle. They have solids, they have the cryogenic main engines with hydrogen and oxygen, and they have the storable bipropellant as control thrusters and small engines on the vehicle itself. So they have all types of engines, and I think these are in some cases state-of-the-art, in some cases old engines. But they're all very highly reliable. And I think the testing process that NASA goes through is extremely intense. And they've worked out their problems in the early days, and I think the performance has been quite good.
Let us bring in a different point of view here from Thomas Gold, a professor at Cornell University, who's been a longtime critic of manned space flights, particularly the shuttle program and the planned space station. Throughout the 1960s, he was a member of the space panel of the President's Science Advisory Committee, which guided U.S. space policy. In the 70s, he testified before Congress against the then-proposed shuttle program. He joins us tonight from public station WCNY in Syracuse. Professor Gold, you told us earlier today you thought this sort of thing was bound to happen. Would you explain why you thought that?
Well, I think that most people who are concerned with the space program considered that space flight is inherently dangerous. Certainly, I've said for years, unfortunately, we'll run that risk. My criticism is not now of the NASA engineers, who I think did their job extremely well. To get 24 flights off the pad and return safely was a tremendous performance. The safety record is incredibly good and much better than many people, including myself, ever thought possible. The criticism that I make is entirely whether it is necessary to subject that many people that frequently to such a risk.
Well, why have you opposed the idea of manned flights?
Most of the jobs that we want to do at this time in space can be done far better, more cheaply, and without personal risk, and with greater continuity with unmanned vehicles. To use men to take unmanned satellites into orbit, I personally think it's crazy. I mean, to make the whole thing a dangerous enterprise when it doesn't need to be that, I see no reason for that. The notion that practicing space flight in low orbit around the Earth takes you any nearer to any of the desirable manned space enterprises, I think it's just plain wrong. You know, I would be most enthusiastic if we could really fly to the stars, or God knows what people are talking about. We cannot even conceive of flying to the nearest planet, to Mars, and land there with a manned mission, so long as we don't have some great new invention of a totally different propulsion system. So long as we have to do it with chemical rockets, we are not going to mount a manned flight even to the nearest planet. So why do it? What are we gaining from practicing in close Earth orbit?
Let me just put back the arguments that NASA's used for the shuttle, that it is very versatile, that it is cheaper, that it is reusable, that it can bring men into a position where they can do things like repair satellites that instruments or mechanical devices cannot do.
You will never bring the money for the shuttle back from repair work. I mean, that is just absolutely outlandish to think that you will repair that many things as to make good the investment in the shuttle. And the other stories, that it is versatile, but what has it been used for? For public relations work and for various attempts so far quite unsuccessful in making any space
Well, what has been lost scientifically by devoting so much money proportionately to manned space flight, say, since the landing on the moon? What has been lost scientifically that could have been gained by using the money otherwise?
You've seen how wonderful the spacecraft, the unmanned spacecraft to the outer planets were, and what magnificent results were brought back from them. The amount of experimentation that could have been carried out had we not devoted this huge amount of money to the manned spaceflight, that could have been used for perfecting such remote control, I don't want to say robots, but remotely controlled machinery. We could have progressed far further in that direction, and we could have had much more wonderful vehicles still than the Voyager. We would have had much better communication systems, because our present method of launching communication satellites is extremely clumsy. I'm sure that the unmanned vehicles will win the day. The European Ariane will almost certainly launch most of the future communication satellites. All that could have progressed very much further, and many scientific missions were cancelled. I'm myself a scientist and would like to see the scientific missions, but I fully realize that the utilitarian use of space is terribly important.
Can I ask you to come back to the question of risk? Is it your argument that NASA has deliberately misled the country about the degree of risk involved in putting men up to do these things?
That would be a very fierce accusation. What they have done, however, is, I think, imprudently used manned flight, which has a great deal of public appeal, and they've used it for the public relations aspect to a great extent, and they have then made what I think was just a pretense that manned spaceflight was going to be of some advantage for the utilitarian and for scientific satellites. For that, I think it has no advantage at all.
Do you think today's tragedy should cause the government and NASA to rethink this whole shuttle program and what is supposed to follow it?
I certainly think that, yes. I certainly think that one should think very hard about using any man in space where he is not absolutely needed or where he is not directly contributing to the future of spaceflight. Just to go and practice with more people in the same low orbit and do it time and again 15 times a year, I think it is just a totally unnecessary and unwarranted risk.
Well, thank you. We'll come back. Jim?
Yes, we go now to a man who was an astronaut on the first flight of Space Shuttle Challenger in April 1983. He's retired Air Force Colonel Donald Peterson, now an independent aerospace consultant, and he joins us tonight from Houston. Colonel Peterson, Dr. Gold said this whole thing is crazy to send man into space on the shuttle. Is he right?
Clearly, I would disagree with Dr. Gold. I really don't know Dr. Gold, and it's a little difficult discussing things in a matter of minutes that probably deserve some study. But I think even Dr. Gold would have to admit that, for example, if you compare what man can do as opposed to what can be done with automated systems, man is far more capable, far more flexible, and you only have to look at, for example, the difference between the United States and the Soviet lunar program to realize that we did far more in the way of understanding and learning about the moon by putting men there than the Russians were able to do with automated systems. So I think the orbiter, excuse me, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so his basic charge that we would be further along, there would be more progress in space exploration with less manned space flight, you just say is wrong, huh?
I think if you measure progress in terms of how many devices you might launch, Dr. Gold might be right, but I think if you measure progress in terms of our capacity to live and work and do meaningful things in space, that man is far more capable than machines.
What about his charge that NASA was interested in the public relations aspect of this, of sending man into space?
I think NASA is interested in good public relations in all of their programs. I don't see any difference in good public relations in the manned space program and in the Discoverer satellite that's out looking at Uranus and in our interest in those pictures. I'm not against good public relations.
Yeah. Did you feel as an astronaut that you were a tool of NASA public relations rather than as a scientist trying to explore the heavens?
No, sir, I didn't feel that way. I suppose if you ask 100 people, you'd get 100 different answers. But I think most of the people here feel that what we do in space is very important and that a manned capability is very important. And I think most of us feel very lucky to have been able to participate.
All right, you flew in this spacecraft in 1983. Do you have any theories as to what might have happened this morning?
No, sir, I don't. I saw the same films that undoubtedly you've seen. And I don't think it really serves any purpose to speculate, and I don't know what happened.
Did you and other astronauts, did you discuss the dangers that were involved in doing this kind of thing?
Not in exactly those words. I think any person who's a career astronaut and who's watched space programs over the years understands that there's some element of risk in any flight. I think if you decide you want to be a career astronaut, you accept that risk, and then you learn to do your job and you do it. And I don't think you spend a great deal of time worrying about and discussing risks.
It was something you never discussed with your fellow astronauts?
I remember one discussion with Paul Weitz, who was the commander of our spacecraft, and basically he said, there's some risk in this, and if that's going to bother you, you ought not to go. And if it's not going to bother you, you ought to put it out of your mind and get on with the job. And that's the only discussion that I remember with other astronauts.
Was it something that you felt that your training prepared you for? Did NASA officials talk to you all and say, hey, wait a minute, you must understand this thing could blow up there, you could die or be seriously injured? Was it part of your training at all?
No, sir, not in that sense. The NASA hires people for these positions that are fairly knowledgeable people in engineering and science, and most of those people understand that you don't build perfect devices and that occasionally a device will fail. And what we had today was a catastrophic failure, and in this program that's been very rare.
Senator Glenn and other fellow astronauts said today that there was a feeling, though, among astronauts that this was bound to happen someday. Did you have that feeling?
I suppose if you're saying the space program is going to go on for hundreds of years, that sooner or later a spacecraft will fail, I think, yes, that's probably an inevitable occurrence. I would not say that I expected it on the 25th flight of the shuttle or the 50th flight of the shuttle, or if you named a flight, I think the odds are that you'd be very safe.
Was Mr. Scott told Robin earlier that the shuttle was considered a relatively safe way to go into space vis-a-vis some of the earlier Apollo and other flights. Would you agree with that?
I think the shuttle has, over the years that it's operated, has proven to be a very safe vehicle, notwithstanding what happened today.
Did you feel safe when you were up there?
Yes, sir. I flew in the Challenger vehicle. We never had a minute's trouble with any phase of the flight, and everything went exactly like it was supposed to.
During the first minute or two of launch, was there any anxiety, a special anxiety that if something went wrong, is more likely to happen here than some other time during the flight?
My personal feeling is that what risk there is to these flights that is probably greater during the early minutes of ascent than anywhere else. And the reason I think that risk is greater is that there are not many options or not many alternatives at that point. If something very serious goes wrong in the first couple of minutes of a flight, it's very difficult to overcome that. Later in the flight, there's
This is videotape of...
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. The crews reported to the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle appeared to have exploded and that we had an impact in the water downrange at a location approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. At the time the data was lost with the vehicle, according to a poll by the flight director, Jay Green, of the positions here in Mission Control, there were no anomalous indications, no indications of problems with the engines or with the SRBs or with any of the other.
Although there were those of you who were following the space program at the time may recall that 3 astronauts were killed in 1967 on a launch pad explosion during the Apollo program. That was in the program that eventually took America to the moon. But you will note that in 1967, when the 3 astronauts were killed, they were killed on the pad while waiting to be launched. This morning's explosion, as you saw, happened 1 minute and 12 seconds about into the launch. After a series of weather and technical delays, the shuttle rose spectacularly off the launch pad this morning at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It seemed to be climbing smoothly, trailing behind it that great blast of fire, that geyser of fire, which suddenly it erupted into a huge fireball, and the whole space shuttle apparatus shot out of control. A voice at Mission Control in Houston, perhaps you heard it on the videotape, said, "We are checking with recovery forces to see what can be done at this point." This is a replay of the videotape.
1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
That awful pray it would never happen scene of the space shuttle exploding in air. Now, on the crucial matter of ejection seats, there are none on board Space Shuttle Challenger. There was no way in practice to make 7 ejection seats work on a shuttle. And in theory, it was thought that no one could survive an ejection from the shuttle. So in any case, we're told that there were no ejection seats on the space shuttle. Now, earlier, I said to you, and I want to explain for clarification, that there are a number of safety procedures aboard the shuttle. There are a number of procedures designed for escape from the shuttle, particularly when it's still on the launch pad. But we now know, we've sought out information and confirmed that there were no ejection seats aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. Now, the explosion was a devastating setback to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration after successfully carrying out 24 space shuttle missions in less than 5 years. There have been 56 U.S. man-in-space missions. That includes the whole first go into space, the moon program, the Apollo program, and the space shuttle program. But in the space shuttle program itself, there have been 24 space shuttle missions in slightly less than 5 years, increasing difficulty with these space shuttle missions in recent weeks and months. There were 7 crew members aboard. That included the school teacher, Christa McAuliffe, 37-year-old New Hampshire school teacher who was selected as America's first citizen in space. That is, citizen not directly connected with the government. You recall that 1 senator and 1 member of the House of Representatives had been fired into space, but never a completely unconnected, if you will, civilian had attempted to be a space passenger before. Mission Control in Houston said debris from the shuttle fell several miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. Recovery forces, as we mentioned, were speeding in that direction, and we showed in the early portion of our CBS News Live report a parachute coming down in the area, and we were told later that was a paramedic who was being parachuted into the sea very near Cape Canaveral to find what that paramedic could among the debris that was beginning to fall. Now, the other crew members aboard the space shuttle, besides the school teacher, Christa McAuliffe, were Commander Francis Scobie, he's 46, the pilot, Michael J. Smith, who's 40, Judith Resnick, who's 36 years old, Ronald E. McNair, who's 35, and Ellison S. Onasuka, who's 39, along with Gregory B. Jarvis, who is 41 years old. All of those, except school teacher McAuliffe, part of the crew. She is second from the left in this photograph. Check me, if you will, Terry, on the second from the left in this photograph is the school teacher McAuliffe. Mission Control has confirmed that parts of the spacecraft fell at 28.64 north latitude, 80.28 degrees west longitude. That's just a few miles off of Cape Canaveral. Ships and helicopters are right now racing to that area. Mission Control Center in Houston said that paramedics, and now they say plural, paramedics had leaped into the water. We had only seen one before. Again, to repeat for emphasis, the space shot took place in Florida, but as the control of the shot, as has been the case for so many years, is Mission Control in Houston. Now, there were twisting contrails of the explosion lingering in the clear morning sky, but Challenger apparently fell into the sea due east of the Kennedy Space Center, and that's where the ships and helicopters are now proceeding to check out that area. Tracking reported that the vehicle had exploded and impacted the water in an area located just east of Cape Canaveral. Recovery forces include a C-130 aircraft. That's a huge transport plane which soon should be circling the area where the debris, what's left of this morning's Space Shuttle Challenger, apparently has come down into the water. While this was the 25th shuttle flight and the 10th flight for this particular space shuttle, the Challenger, the disaster it's no good trying to call it anything but that. The disaster for NASA is the worst since the first Apollo moon capsule burned on the launch pad on, that was January 27th, 1967, killing the 3 astronauts aboard the pad. A brilliant ball of flame erupted when this $1.1 billion shuttle exploded this morning. And shortly after the explosion, President Reagan's principal spokesman, Larry Speakes, came out at the White House to say simply and directly with sadness that President Reagan was aware of what had happened and was saddened and shocked by it, and that the president, along with other Americans, now simply had to wait for information as it comes in. Bill Plant is standing by at the White House now. Bill, has there been any further information since that Speakes briefing, and what is the situation there? How much do they know?
Dan, they don't seem to know very much at all. In fact, they told us that they were getting the information from the news media, just as we were. They had no direct word from NASA about any survivors. There, frankly, doesn't seem to be much hope here. The president was told by the vice president and the national security advisor, Admiral Poindexter. They found him in the Oval Office where he was preparing to greet a group of news people and brief them on the State of the Union message. We were waiting for that briefing. We saw the national security advisor get up, confer with an aide, and leave. And within a minute or so after that, an advisor to Donald Reagan, chief of staff, brought in a piece of paper. Reagan looked at it and said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you that the space shuttle has blown up." So the president, too, who, after he was notified, went in and watched the television coverage. He was reported to have watched in stunned silence, to have said nothing, is waiting for further details, Dan.
Thank you, Bill Plant, at the White House. As we said, one of the astronauts aboard, school teacher Sharon Christa McAuliffe, was a high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. Students there reportedly cheered loudly this morning when the Challenger first took off from the pad, and then they sat in stunned silence as the shuttle apparently exploded. Reporters and photographers were immediately ordered out of the school, and understandably so, and the students were ordered back to their classrooms. Let's take a look again at the videotape of what they saw as the Space Shuttle Challenger was lifted off this morning. This is about 3/4 of a minute into the flight.
Throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Roger, go with throttle up.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
After that, no one knew what to say. On the basis of veteran space watchers, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration has said nothing about what the cause of the explosion would be. But on the basis of veteran space watchers, what the most popular hypothesis at the moment is that the explosion may have been caused by the solid rocket boosters. Again, for those of you who may have joined us late, this is a scale model of the shuttle. The shuttle sets aboard its main fuel tank here, but off to the side are the solid rocket boosters, which are supposed to put it into orbit. The way this works, the solid rocket boosters are responsible for the launch and liftoff and getting into orbit. Then they're supposed to drop away once they have expended their solid rocket fuel, and then the shuttle, piggybacking on its main fuel tank, goes on up into orbit and eventually is, always in the past, is separated from its main fuel tank and then is in orbit and out there to do its work. The hypothesis at the moment, one of the theories is that because this happened a minute and 12 seconds
going aboard the Challenger, Christa McAuliffe, the teacher, said it's going to go today. This was one time she expressed extreme confidence that they were going to be able to get into orbit and that they would make it today. Now the Challenger, Dan, is the real workhorse of the shuttle fleet. The 4 shuttles, the Challenger...
Was a concern. Delay till 11:38, just minutes before the scheduled liftoff. I was out there in the spectator stands with hundreds of people, among them 18 school children from Christa McAuliffe's hometown, third-grade students who attended school with Christa's son, Scott Corrigan. Those children watched, gasping at the liftoff, very impressed, obviously. It appeared that very few of the spectators knew what had happened until about a minute into the liftoff when NASA control announced that something had gone wrong. The Shuttle Challenger simply blew apart as we saw it from the ground. I am told with a force of 2.5 million pounds of thrust. Awesome power that even NASA admits may leave very little to recover.
Let me ask you this. There must be turmoil there, John, at the Cape, as I'm sure there is in Houston as well. Do you have any indication from anyone there of an official or expert nature what may have happened?
No idea.
Well, that's simple, and that is clear, John.
We understand, Peter, that the recovery crews, we saw 2 parachutes that NASA cameras picked up and showed us floating to the ground.
David, who?
We are being told that it is believed that those are paramedics headed into the recovery area to see what they can find.
Okay, John, thank you very much. John Quinones at the Cape. Of course, once the Challenger was taken off mission control, that is to say the control of the mission shifts to Houston in Texas. And so at Cape Canaveral, why, as we suggest, there may be turmoil this morning, there is not an absolute amount they're going to be able, I think, Steve, to provide us in terms of information.
We've been told, Peter, that President Reagan was watching in stunned silence the replay after he was informed of what had happened. And one of the first recognitions of this morning's apparent tragedy came from the House of Representatives, which declared a moment of silence. The Reverend James David Ford, the chaplain, leading the House in the silence. Let's listen.
And at this special moment, let us remember in silent prayer those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago off Florida. Let us pray.
Reverend James David Ford leading the House of Representatives in a moment of silence.
May your spirit, O Lord, be with them, and may your love follow them and their families this day and every day, we pray. Amen.
This recognition for the 7 crew members of the Shuttle Challenger. The Challenger exploding less than 2 minutes off the launch pad this morning. No official word yet on the fate of the 7 crew members, but there is very little to hope for at this point.
I've just been thinking, Steve, as to why people at Mission Control, even people watching this on television, might not have been alarmed in the first instance, because about 2.5 minutes into flight, normally, when those big external tanks break off, we are accustomed now to seeing this great ball of fire as those 2 tanks drop off and fall into the Atlantic. While we go on, by the way, we hope that someone behind the scenes is listening very hard to Mission Control in Houston and we haven't heard anything from them in the last few minutes. They are very quiet, I am told, at the moment, but it behooves us, I think, not to write off these 7 people until we're told so by Mission Control. I was thinking of the President, because it was he who made this determination that we'd have a teacher in space, because the teacher was so symbolic of the aspirations of Americans in general. I think the President must have taken this very hard today.
11,000 applicants after the President made that announcement that
the teacher, would be the first private citizen in space, and Christa McAuliffe, the very dynamic and vivacious teacher from New Hampshire, the one who made the final selection. And as many of you saw just a few moments ago, Lynn Scher's report showing how much she obviously was enjoying her training as an astronaut. One of her colleagues at her school in New Hampshire describing her as something of a risk-taker. Christa McAuliffe, among the 7 crew members aboard the Challenger when it exploded this morning.
The element of risk clearly is felt most poignantly by the families. Last week, for example, Kathy Lee Crosby on ABC was interviewing Christa McAuliffe's husband, Steve, and you get some sense there of enormous pride, but also anxiety. Let's look at that for a second.
What about Christa's special qualities? What do you think it is about her that's so special that she's bringing to this mission?
Oh, I think obviously she's very bright. She's a super teacher, and she's genuinely a nice person, and I think she has that ability to just excite people. Certainly she's excited me over the years.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Has she been disappointed at all by the disappointments of the Space Shuttle Challenger or Columbia? That there was a frequent delays in taking off, and then there was a difficulty in landing. Is she concerned about that?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I think we've always looked at that as proof positive that they don't launch them unless it's absolutely perfect, and if there's anything the slightest bit out of order, they wait and correct it, and I certainly take comfort in that, and I wouldn't mind at all that it be postponed if there's something wrong.
You bet. We wish you all the best, Stephen. God bless. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
We'll be right.
Interview not with Kathy Lee Crosby, Kathy Lee Johnson on Good Morning America last week with Christa McAuliffe's husband, who says there's this tremendous confidence in NASA and the space program. And while we sometimes got very frustrated, and I must say took a few shots at NASA when Columbia was delayed 6 times, as I recall. There it goes again, something's gone wrong. It is that determination that's always existed in the space program to make sure that nothing goes wrong, which leads to these delays. And the search for what went wrong today, which, as you said earlier, is an incredible setback to the shuttle program, at least, is just going to make, I think, people that much more conscious of safety as they were after the Apollo blow-up in '67.
When you look at husband Steve there in that tape recording, then you stop to realize that he and the 2 children, McAuliffe children, were watching live the launch this morning. And, of course, less than 2 minutes after the launch, the massive explosion in space.
It is now just a little after 12:30 in the eastern United States, and not by any means to repeat it for the sake of repeating it, but because that's a program change in many of the places around the country. We're going to run again the liftoff of the Challenger as it took off from Cape Canaveral this morning. John Quinones described it to us from the Cape just a few moments ago as perfectly normal in every respect. You'll recall it had been delayed yesterday because of high weather, and it had been delayed the day before because they couldn't get a screw fully tightened down on one of the hatches. But for those of you around the country who may just be joining us now for the first time and may not have heard the news, or perhaps not have seen it, here again is the liftoff of the shuttle from the Cape this morning. That is not the liftoff. That is the subsequent tragic result as something blows up about 7 to 10 miles above the Atlantic Ocean across the Cape. I must tell you, Steve, having now seen that 4 or 5 times, that great ball of fire looks to me like it may be one of the solid rocket boosters.
An enormous power, 2.5 million pounds of thrust. That is all a part of that launch that we have come to take so for granted. And that, of course, was the mix that we just saw exploding once again in that replay of what took place at shortly after 11:39 launch time, Eastern time this morning. The Space Shuttle Challenger with its crew of 7. We do not have any official word yet on the fate of the 7 crew members. 2 women actually aboard, Christa McAuliffe, the school teacher from New Hampshire, but also Judy Resnick, who was one of the mission specialists who had already logged 144 hours in space.
Okay. I'm told we can now look at the entire launch sequence, that is to say when the astronauts and the mission specialists went back on board early this morning, and there they are, liftoff from the Cape.
Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program. Roger, roll, Challenger.
Nonchalant.
Roll program confirmed.
Control
Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Accelerating towards 2,000 miles an hour.
This 1,977 miles per hour, 10.4 miles up, 8 miles out at the time of the explosion.
And you are seeing that in slow motion, by the way, now.
Distance 7 nautical miles.
This the first in-flight disaster for the U.S. space program in 56 manned missions, going back to the original Shepard flight.
Steve, would you tell someone in our control room they have a key open and we're hearing everything that's going on in the building?
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Once again, for those of you who have just joined us, there has been a disaster on the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger with its 7-man crew. The shuttle exploding 1 minute, 15 seconds after launch from Cape Canaveral this morning. There had been a delay, one caused by a faulty gauge. There had also been a delay that was caused by ice forming on the pad because the temperature was 24 degrees this morning at Cape Canaveral. No indication that that had anything to do with the enormous explosion that took place as the shuttle was just reaching that maximum period of thrust in what had appeared to be an extremely normal launch. There was the normal excitement in the voice of mission control, and then the almost detached voice reading off the various numbers on what appeared to be a picture-perfect launch, but then was interrupted by this devastating explosion.
Steve, it is only now, 33 minutes after noon in the east, that all of the rescue teams are being allowed into what we will call the search area for the moment, because there was so much debris raining down from 10 miles up above that NASA feared for the safety of those people going to look for survivors, principally, is what they've got to look for. So only now, about 35 minutes after noon in the east, are people getting into the area to begin to search those waters of the Atlantic, which we have seen so desolate this morning.
And we might remind our viewers that while the earliest shuttles did have an escape capsule, the present ones have no particular escape mechanisms whatsoever. The capsule is its own entity.
It is that point in a mission where while the concern is immensely high at all times and you're beginning to push out towards orbit there, you're not as concerned. You'll recall in many of the space programs, the great concern has been for people on the launching pad.
Yes.
Back in 1967, when Gus Grissom, among others, was killed when the Apollo blew up on the launching pad, it became enormous concern for how do you get people out at that particular time. When the shuttle is driving for orbit and everything looks A-OK, you stop thinking about it to some extent.
The explosion occurred this morning, we're told, at about the time that the Challenger was to enter its period of maximum aerodynamic pressure, 526,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, all aboard, and the massive explosion.
The first flight disaster in 56 missions, and as Steve has been saying so accurately, this is the 25th of the shuttle missions. And this highly accelerated program, you'll recall just the other day, they had to move, was it Columbia or Challenger? I get them mixed up sometimes, from California back quickly in order to get it ready, because the mission program is really going, and there is a lot of demand now for people in all realms of industry, politics, the military, to get up and use the capacities that the shuttle has provided for the U.S.
In fact, the shuttle program becoming a point of controversy because The question is it competitive with the European unmanned program that's also been putting payloads into space for private industry and for other users? The delays that the shuttle program has been experiencing the last few months, and weather in some cases, technical in other cases, has led to many calls for a reevaluation of the shuttle program. That, of course, is going to be an enormous question at the present time.
For the moment, of course, it is a human question with 7 crew members on board and unaccounted for as the result of a devastating explosion on board Challenger this morning. We are again able to call on the services, as we do so often, of the former Apollo astronaut Gene Cernan, who at the moment is on a telephone in Houston. Gene, I know you have heard the news. Try again. Gene, do you hear me to start with?
I sure do, Peter.
Gene, would you mind turning your television set down or the radio that is in your immediate vicinity, and perhaps we can hear you rather than it?
Okay, it's all down. I'm all private here.
Okay, well then it is something at our end. Perhaps, Gene, if you'll stand by just for a second. I don't think we should impose that kind of sound on people. We very much want to hear what you have to say. Steve, I was talking about being at the White House this morning and saw the Vice President on the way in. He has also been very shaken by this. He was on his way to see the President. And the reaction in this city will have an enormous power because of the political impetus that the space program has been given by various administrations in the United States. The President and his particular attachment to sending a teacher into space to reflect American ideals. And we have now reaction in the White House then for the President, the Vice President. We have it in the Congress, at the House of Representatives, with moments of silent prayer. Senator Garn from Utah, really the first civilian or non-NASA person who was one of the overseers of NASA's program and NASA's budget. He went up. Everybody very much shaken in this capital, as best I can tell, certainly in my ear this morning, by this awful tragedy.
All of us shaken. Senator Garn, we're told now, is going to have a statement in about 20 minutes. He, of course, was the first member of Congress to go into space, a veteran pilot in his own right, and that's a perspective that you just don't share with anyone else.
Gene Cernan, I hope, is now standing by without a great deal of interference. Gene, can you hear me clearly now?
I sure can, Peter.
Talk to us for a bit. What do you think?
It's pretty tough to talk about a lot of things at this point in time. This is, I guess, the one catastrophic incident that we all knew was possible going way back to day one, I guess, in the space program, and it probably always will be possible as we look into the future when man is involved in space that we couldn't quite fully protect against, except to build a vehicle that was obviously not 100, but 99+% safe. This is a thing we tried to legislate out again since day one, and successfully we did it. It's not enough to say that you can justify exploration with human lives, although that's been the case historically. I guess that's where we find ourselves in today.
Gene, is there any particular point in the launch sequence that they might have been at that was known to be a critical point?
Well, of course, the first stages of just getting off the pad, those first several seconds, we all knew even in Apollo, the first 30 or 40 or 50 seconds of that flight, if something went wrong, the chances of getting through that phase were pretty grim. That would probably be true in the case of the shuttle also. What puzzles me is, though it was well on its way, it had enough, if you will, airspeed, it was going fast enough. Should they have recognized the problem, the shuttle was built to be able to get rid of that external tank, which was, you know, I'm not going to speculate, but appears to be the major source of the explosion, because the solid rocket boosters appeared to break away from the force of the explosion and fly about their merry way without guidance. But the shuttle was designed to be able to, having recognized the problem approaching, be able to break away from that external tank of fuel and those solid rocket boosters and do a maneuver, although it was a complicated maneuver, do a maneuver which would indeed bring the crew, most important part of the payload, obviously, the crew and the shuttle, back to a safe landing at the Kennedy Spaceport. That's why there were so many delays in the past for weather, because in case of a problem, the crew had to be able to see the runway and get back. But this thing obviously caught everyone by surprise. The flight controllers saw no problems in their telemetry and their information. The crew was just preparing for throttling back the engines up to their full force, which have got them into orbit. And then all of a sudden, it was just like a bolt of lightning, I guess.
Gene, have you got access to a television set where you are?
I sure do.
We're going to roll the launch again from the very beginning. Would you, can you see it?
Unfortunately, the local network station is on local network news, and I don't have access.
And liftoff.
Okie dokie. We're seeing liftoff.
The 25th.
Gene, describe to us, because you know it so well anyway, what happens from liftoff or right off?
Well, the liquid engines, the engines that are fueled by liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, which is by nature explosive, but they're very good propellants. We used them way back in Apollo. Fire and for a few seconds, and the computers say everything is okay on a pad, and then the solid rocket boosters fire, and you can equate those to a firecracker. They're gunpowder, basically, if you want an analogy. They fire, and as soon as they fire, the shuttle is on its way. The solid rocket boosters fly for a period of time to help boost the entire spacecraft to an orbit where the liquid engine then can sustain its velocity or its travel into orbit.
Beginning to roll over now, Gene.
Okay, pardon?
It's beginning to roll over now, right?
Okay, it's beginning to roll over. I'm not able to see this at this point in time, but when it begins to roll over, there is a point at which the thickness of the air, or the density of the air, and the speed of the shuttle itself create the greatest pressure, and that's where the shuttle.
John, I understand that.
And that's where the shuttle will tend to.
John, we're going to call you in at some point.
And create pressure on it, so they throttle the engines down to go a little slower through
Jonas, do you hear ground like
that area. They then power up to 105%, which is what they expect to do of the maximum rated thrust of the engine. And
Gene, let me interrupt you for a second. We see in our picture now the explosion has occurred, what looks like one of the solid rocket boosters shooting off to the left of the screen in space. Does that suggest to you that the explosion would have been on the external tank on board?
Peter, far be it from me to speculate, but as I've seen that sequence, and I think if you look closely, you'll see both solid rocket motors appear to continue to fire. We've seen them many times after they shut down, break away, and fall back in the oceans on many other sequences. In this case, they did indeed break away. It looks like the force of the explosion broke them away, and they continued to fire. There's no reason that they shouldn't fire. There's no way to shut them down anyway. And they fired, although somewhat aimlessly, as you see the smoke, they travel through space. And then what was the bulk, the core of the shuttle spacecraft itself in the external tank has just disappeared. So it appears to me...
Gene, let me interrupt you again. We see something now traveling at a very high rate of speed down towards the ocean. You've seen that sequence? Have you any thought what that might be? The close-up shot, you've seen it?
Well, again, it might very well be, if it looks like there's any kind of thrust or fire coming out of it, I would assume it might very well be one of those solid rocket boosters without any direction, no computer telling it where to go, and of course gravity's taking over and it's just pointing down towards the earth.
Officer, that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at...
But it appears, again, it's so difficult to speculate in a case like this, Peter, but it appears to me that the explosion occurred within obviously the propellant area, or the shuttle and the external tank itself, and not in the solid rocket boosters. Solid rocket boosters are inherently safe. They either work and burn till extinction, or they don't work at all.
Gene, it is unfair of me to even ask you to speculate, so I will ask you for the moment if you wouldn't mind staying with us on the telephone. God, Steve, we've got people who are much better at these models than you and me. But
I have you now on television, Peter, so I'm watching what you're doing.
Well, Gene, I hope I don't make any mistakes in trying to explain to people the basics of what may have happened here. Here is the shuttle itself. Here is Challenger. It lifted off from the ground, as you know, in a position like this, and was beginning to angle its way into orbit, going not only upwards, but going downrange. And these two solid rocket boosters, these solid rocket fuels, are the ones that you always see burning so brightly. At some point, about 2 minutes and 10 seconds into the mission, just about the time we saw the explosion this morning, being a normal occurrence, these two rockets fall away, and the main engine continues to push the Challenger towards its orbit above the Earth. Now, as best we can tell by looking at the pictures, it is in here where the problem appears to have occurred.
It appears, Peter, that those solid rocket motors were still firing and attached as they were supposed to be, and that,
Gene, can you see the picture now?
Yes, I surely can.
Tell us about all this.
Well, you know, in order to make the shuttle itself, the space plane as you're looking at it there, as light as possible and able to withstand the heat of reentry and then land on a runway, it was decided long ago to put the fuel external to the shuttle itself. So the shuttle basically has no fuel in it at all to get it in orbit. It has fuel to fire little rocket engines to control it once it's in orbit, but it would carry the fuel externally on that big tank that is very obvious there in front of you. And that tank would be jettisoned just when the fuel was almost burned out, just before the shuttle went into orbit, but the shuttle indeed would have just about the right velocity to itself go on into orbit, where the tank would then break up, and it was the one thing that was not recoverable. It would break up and burn up in the atmosphere.
So, Gene, you're saying that there has not been in the shuttle program any provision made for the danger here for crew to break away in any way, shape, or form?
Well, yes, there was. As I say, if you could recognize danger, apparently this morning it came about so quickly, everybody on the ground, from what I can hear and understand, and certainly everybody in the spacecraft, did not anticipate any problem. But if there had been a problem, what would have been done is the shuttle, indeed, the space plane as you see it there, would have broken away from the external tank and the solid rocket boosters, and itself come back to land at Kennedy Space Center just like it normally comes in during reentry. And it could have indeed come in and landed had we recognized that there was a problem forthcoming. But the suddenness, the catastrophic, you know, we saw it, and we heard the people talking within seconds of that explosion. Nobody had any idea, obviously, that there was something amiss. Now, that big tank, remember, is carrying nothing but liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, which are two of the highest performance propellants, and that's why we use them for their weight. We've used them in the space program for many, many years. Very explosive, but very reliable when they're in control. And at that moment we see where, you know, it's almost like someone broke the barrier between the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen in that tank, and they completely immersed themselves in each other and instantaneously exploded.
That's a booster there, isn't it, Gene?
That's a booster. That is one of the solid boosters without guidance, obviously just heading a miss. And it's going to just, there appears to be both solid boosters are broken away and don't know where they're going, but there is no signal to shut them down, and indeed they were not designed to be shut down because there was no need to anyway.
Gene, stand by for just a second, would you? And we're very grateful for your explanation about this extraordinarily sad accident in which, in case you have just joined us, 7 people are reported missing at this point, the 7 astronauts on board. Steve?
Peter, we have the reaction from Vice President Bush, who has spoken with reporters. Let's listen.
No more than anyone else knows. It's a terrible tragedy. Well, just enormous tragedy, and
what does this mean for the space shuttle?
Great concern for the families of people. Horrible feeling on all of that. Well, I think it's way too early to know that. I mean, it's been an extraordinarily, viable program, and this is just a tragic thing. So I really don't have any detail on it.
When did the president?
Except the motion, saw the president was in there to help tell him about it, and then went in afterward to see him, and his concerns are the same for the families and everybody else involved in all of this. Well, just as I've described, with great concern for the families and no specific things on that. Yeah, and then I walked back in to see him just now.
You went in to tell him with whom?
Well, it's all over the, just a whole bunch of people were in there when we walked in. He was doing some briefing, but then afterwards I saw him, and he's obviously very, very concerned about this. No, I think maybe I can't remember who was first. Everybody just went in there. No, not then, no. No, he was being briefed. Huh?
Were you watching?
Well, I'd seen a minute as somebody came rushing in and told me about it. I flicked it on, then went down to be sure he knew about it. But well, he went in. Yeah, he went into his little study, down there, and went in and turned on. I went back to my office. I just wanted to be sure he knew about it.
I think we can As we look at the recovery area in the Atlantic Ocean off Cape Canaveral, Florida, we can attest to the great shock at the White House, as there has been also at the Soviet Embassy. The Soviets have already issued a statement saying on behalf of the Soviet Embassy how they extend their deep condolences and sympathy to the American people in connection with this enormous tragedy. That is the search area off Cape Canaveral out in the Atlantic you're looking at. Steve, I've been calling them missing, and the only way we can take you, I think, statistically or carefully closer to it is to listen to a senior NASA official this morning who told Congressman Manuel Lujan of New Mexico that it doesn't look like any lives were saved. This is according to the congressman's aide who told this to the Associated Press. NASA officials told the congressman it does not look like any lives were saved in this traumatic explosion.
The 7 members of the crew on their 4th attempt today, when they finally did launch, the commander, Francis Dick Scobie, veteran of the program. You see them at breakfast this morning before they boarded the Space Shuttle Challenger for this most ill-fated of launches. Also, pilot Mike Smith. Others on the crew, Judy Resnick, a veteran of a previous shuttle mission, Allison Onizuka, Ron McNair, Greg Jarvis, and of course, school teacher Christa McAuliffe from New Hampshire, whose husband and 2 children were watching the launch and obviously were eyewitnesses to that momentous explosion less than 2 minutes into the flight of the Space Shuttle Challenger.
Christa McAuliffe has been asked countless times why it was that she applied and why she went into the space program, and this was her answer.
I'm sure they're excited.
Why in the beginning did you want to be one of the teachers who applied for the program and fly in the space shuttle?
Well, it was a challenge, and it was something that I always ask my students, you know, to go and seek whatever they feel they can do and reach a little higher. The whole process was kind of exciting for me because I knew that there would be people from each state who would be coming together, and I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to talk with all these educators and exchange ideas, and that was really fun. And that's basically why I decided to send in that application, never dreaming that it would get this far.
Were you a fan of the...
Were you a fan of the space program? Well, she certainly was. In fact, listen to her kids over the last few days talk about her, because we've all been up there in New Hampshire, right, wanting... I think we should make one point very clear here, that the attention that invariably falls on Christa McAuliffe today is in no way a reflection of how sadly I'm sure the nation feels about the other 6 crew members on board. But because she was the first true citizen to fly on board, because President Reagan had so surprised the world during his 1984 re-election campaign when he said that a teacher was going to be in space, she has attracted an enormous amount of attention. One of the most impressive things, listening to her students, is how she managed to take in her classroom theory and practicality and put it together. It wasn't enough to tell kids about a canning factory. You had to take them to the canning factory.
And everybody remembers 1 or 2 teachers in their own background who have that same capacity to ignite the imagination and the special interest that owns the appetite for education. Christa McAuliffe, obviously that kind of a teacher, and the person who was selected out of 11,000 applicants to be that first private citizen public school teacher to go into space.
In fact, her high school principal, Steve, has already been quoted on the wires saying it is awful, it is just too awful even to contemplate. And as you pointed out earlier, about 200 pupils and teachers had gathered in the school auditorium to watch the liftoff live because there was so much pride.
Judith Resnick, the 2nd woman aboard the shuttle on this mission, had been the 2nd woman in space. That had become a routine now, to have women among the crew members on the shuttle program.
You ask my daughter, who women in space have certain magic for young women. I'll tell you, ask my daughter to name the highest woman in the world. She always says Sally Ride.
Sally Ride, who was first, yes.
Just a reminder again of where we are at this point. You must surely now have a sense of this terrible tragedy that has occurred. About 2 minutes after liftoff at Cape Canaveral, something blew up. It is the opinion, and he's very cautious about offering an opinion at this point, of Gene Cernan, the former Apollo astronaut who's been contributing editor to us for a long time, that it was not the solid rockets which drive the shuttle so far towards its orbit that blew up, that it appears to have been something either on board or in the main tank, which was right directly underneath the Challenger. If you have seen the pictures, you've seen it happen terribly, terribly quickly. So fast, in fact, that the mission controller just simply went on talking at one point about what was happening on the mission while the explosion was actually taking place. You know that 7 people, 7 Americans have died in this, the first accident to occur actually in the air. Those of you who've been associated with space for a long time will remember that the Apollo test crew, Virgil Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, died when their rocket blew up on the pad. There was fire in the spacecraft and blew up back in January of 1967.
Once again, the explosion that took place at 11:39 this morning, less than 2 minutes after the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger with its crew of 7. We should point out that this was still in the period when the 2 rocket boosters were firing. They have a firing time of 2 minutes and 10 seconds, but it does not appear that they were the principal cause of the explosion. NASA being very deliberate and very careful in conveying any information. What we do know is that rescue paramedic teams have been sent to the area in the Atlantic where debris has been coming down. One of the problems, however, so much debris has been falling out of space that they had to delay the insertion of some of the paramedics to prevent them from being hit by some of the debris coming back into the ocean.
And that's the area we're looking at, Steve, the search area off the Cape. Recall the Challenger was about 10 miles up and 20, perhaps 26 miles, am I correct, Mike, downrange. And think back, if you will, for comparison to the explosion on board the Air India 747 in the Irish Sea, how long it took to pick through the incredible amount of debris that occurred in the ocean. So while we are all, in a sense, I think, waiting for the word from Mission Control, some sort of formal word, what I suspect we already know, the search for what has happened is going to go on for weeks, if not months.
The American space program, obviously, at its lowest point after the very precipitous and unexpected explosion this morning of the Shuttle Challenger. The Challenger had been delayed 3 previous times in trying to get off on this mission. Weather had been a factor. Technical problems had been a factor. Even this morning, there was further delay, in part because ice had gathered on the pad, 24 degrees at the Cape this morning before lunchtime. And yet, after the liftoff, everyone called it a perfect lift. NASA actually saying that there was no indication whatsoever of any trouble. Suddenly, the explosion and the Challenger was gone.
Mission Control, just to repeat, gave us no indication whatsoever that there was any problem with the engines. And you heard Gene Cernan, who we'll talk to again in a second. You heard Gene talk about the capacity to break away the actual shuttle itself from the main engines or from the solid rocket engines. Were there any possible warning of trouble coming? But it was a mission described as being perfect up until the time the explosion occurred.
Nothing more revealing than what you have already mentioned, that the mission controller actually went ahead reading off figures even after those of us watching television had seen and sensed the horror of what had been happening. Let's go back now to John Quinones at the Cape, who has new information. John?
Steve, NASA is now telling us that those search teams are now going over an area 18 miles from Cape Canaveral in the Atlantic Ocean. They have not reported back on anything that they may have found as yet. It is indeed a sad tragedy here. When Christa McAuliffe went into the White Room for final preparations this morning before she entered the shuttle, she was handed an apple by a member of the closeout crew, and the whole crew wishing her good luck. The school teachers' parents were present here watching the liftoff in person, and they saw first the successful launch, as usual, a majestic launch. There were no indications that anything was wrong at that point, but then seconds after that liftoff, Challenger blew apart. There was no sound that we could hear of any impact or any explosion, just a reddish burst of energy, 2.5 million pounds of thrust and plumes and streams of white smoke. It reminded many of us here of the old Apollo missions. It looked to us like the separation of stages of that rocket. The first stage of the rocket would explode away, if you recall, and then fall apart, and then the capsule would continue shooting skyward. That's what it looked like from our vantage point. After the people in the viewing stands, including some school children from McAuliffe's hometown, were told of the explosion, some began to cry. One woman went as far as calling for an end to the entire space program after this tragedy, perhaps a natural reaction after watching the tragedy here live. ABC News is now being told by a member of a contingency rescue team, these are men trained to recover the remains of a spacecraft in case of an accident like this one. He told us that if indeed there was an explosion of that force and that magnitude, there would be nothing left to recover. Officially, again, NASA has not even confirmed nothing. They're only saying that there has been an apparent explosion.
John, John, I think we both know that the space community is a pretty tight-knit community. Have you had any sense of how they feel in that community itself?
No, Peter, we have not. We have been monitoring NASA control and have not had a chance to go out, but obviously it is hit very, very hard on this community.
We are looking, John Quinones, thank you very much, at the search area about 18 miles off the Cape, and the sun beginning to break down across that portion of the Atlantic Ocean today. Gene Cernan is back with us on the telephone now. Gene, how does this affect people in the space community? How does it affect those of you who were astronauts? I mean, are you different than we are in this respect?
Yeah, it's, I don't mind to say, it's devastating. I guess I said earlier, it's the kind of thing you legislate out. You don't ever ignore. You build the safest machine that human mind can create, and yet you know that anything that's worth it is worth the risk. Again, that's not to say that 7 lives could be exchanged for anything at this point in time. But it's going to be devastating, and this is not strictly in my opinion, a catastrophe for NASA or for the space community. This is a national, even an international catastrophe that we're going to have to examine very closely, look at it, and not live with, but...
Gene, will you stand by for just a second? I apologize for interrupting you, but Senator Jake Garn of Utah is now going to have some comments about this tragedy on Capitol Hill. We are trying to acquire the senator's audio from Capitol Hill, former member of a shuttle crew, as we tell you on the screen there, a man who has a deep dedication to NASA and who is one of its political overseers, in a sense, in terms of its budgeting. And we do not, it seems to me, Steve, need to hear him this morning to see exactly how he feels.
Certainly see the emotion on his face.
We go back to him now.
Yes.
And the benefits that come from it. And the crew members that I knew so well, I would expect that they would want us to go ahead with the space program after we have gone through the proper investigations and analysis and know what happened.
How should we go about investigating this?
Well, obviously, you have to gather all of the data. It has been impounded at this point. There'll have to be a lot of studies, but there are some superbly qualified experts in this area that I think will be able to determine what the failure was.
Senator, you were on board the space shuttle. You felt that tremendous boost that you got. Now, from the telemetry that we heard, the voice data that we heard, they had just told the pilot to go to full throttle, and he had said he was throttling up. What happens at that moment?
You have a combination of the solid rocket booster power and liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the main tank. And because most of your thrust comes from the solid rocket boosters, while you're still in the atmosphere, you can exceed the maximum dynamic pressure. So the main engines are only at about 60% of power until you get further out of the atmosphere. And they had just been given the command to throttle up, and then you go to 104% or maximum power on the solids, or on the liquids. And so that is exactly what had taken place. They were high enough so they would not endanger the orbiter from too much pressure, and were given that order that they could proceed to increase the power.
What are some of the things that can go wrong at that moment?
Well,
you have a very large external tank of very volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. And you're just simply, it's like in an automobile, you are putting more fuel. You're pushing down on the accelerator, you're putting more fuel to bring more power. And of course, at this point, we don't know whether it was one of the solids, we don't know whether it was the liquid engines or not. There's just no way to know at this point.
Senator, what was your opinion of the amount of missions that NASA had scheduled for this year? Do you think that they were capable of going ahead with 14 or 15 safely?
Yes, I think so. The major problem these last couple of missions has been weather, and that is something that NASA cannot control. But yes, I think the program was mature enough that, and with the opening of the second pad, Pad B, which Challenger was launched from this morning, with 2 pads and also the addition of the 4th orbiter, yes, I think they were capable of that schedule.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to civilians in space from now on?
Well, I can't judge what decisions NASA will make, but my own opinion, again, after the investigations, we should proceed with the program, and that would include the civilians in space program as well.
As a civilian yourself going in, were you adequately warned that something like this could happen?
Oh, of course. The training is very thorough and very adequate. In my own case, having flown more than 10,000 hours, I was certainly aware that there are dangers in flying. However, I still feel very strongly that I'm much safer in flying an aircraft than any day that I'm on the Capital Beltway, and I don't mean that to be facetious at all. We kill nearly 50,000 people a year on the in the highways of this country because of half of them because of drunk driving. I wish we'd pay a lot more attention to that.
Senator, should there have been some way for them, or was there any way for them to get out at this point? Should there have been?
No, I don't think so. In Columbia originally during the test phase, when just they were sending 2 test pilots up, they did have an escape capsule. The program had been proved safe enough, in my opinion, that they didn't need them in the other orbiters, and Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes, that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Senator, in light of all of the delays surrounding recent shuttles and this one, do you think that NASA may have been too anxious to get this one off the ground?
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. And we woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Graham Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on and does not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator, how lucky did you feel today that you returned safely?
Well, I don't feel particularly lucky. I think the program is reliable. In all programs, in flight test programs for aircraft, we have accidents. And I don't, it's a surprise to me that it happened, but I would go again tomorrow. If NASA would let me go, I would go again.
What effect is this likely to have on the community of astronauts?
Well, first of all, they're all such a close-knit group. They're not looking any beyond today except the sorrow of losing some of their companions. You go through each one. I knew Christa McAuliffe the least of them because she wasn't there. Greg Jarvis I trained with. Dick Scobie I knew. Mike Smith was my mother hen, and you go on the Zuka flew in January last year when I was flying, so it's and where they live together all the time, they train together, they fly together. There's obviously utter shock and disbelief down at Houston today among the astronaut corps.
On your mission, was the crew equipped with parachutes and were there ejection seats?
No, no. Only Columbia had them at the beginning of the mission, just during the first, I don't remember, 3 or 4 missions.
Senator J. Garn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Jake Garn from Utah, one of the Congress's most astute and devoted overseers of NASA, giving us really the first feel we have this morning from an individual of what it's like to be on the shuttle. We have heard it many times before from many people, but there is Senator Garn emphasizing some I think some very important things. First of all, that he would go again if NASA would have a chance, that he feels safer in the air than he does on the roads of America, that he feels the country should emphasize safe driving. And making the point, at the risk of paraphrasing him, that man does not explore the heavens without some kind of risk. That risk leading this morning to the loss of 7 Americans, including 2 women, including the first teacher in space, in a catastrophic explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, just as it was approaching that moment of separation when the solid rocket boosters fall away and the Challenger pushes on for its first orbit in space. And also saying that in response to criticism on occasion from some people that NASA delays unwillingly some of the missions, he was relating what it was like to wake up on a wonderful sunny morning at the Cape, find out there was a tiny thing wrong, and having NASA emphasize again that particular safety factor. Do not go until you are assured that everything is A-OK. And for those of you who have seen the now videotape or the live coverage this morning of the rocket going into space, it all happened so incredibly quickly. Senator Garn making the point again, as we've made a number of times this morning, that the particular space shuttle, the Challenger, did not have an escape capsule on board. Previous shuttles have had some facility for an escape on board. But making the point that I think must surely be obvious to any of us who have looked at this morning, that had there been an escape capsule on board, the force of that explosion, going almost 2,000 miles an hour, reaching its maximum moment of thrust, and with all of that hydrogen and that oxygen together, and the space extra fuel tanks on the side, that even a space escape capsule would not have enabled these 7 people on board to survive. To remind you, 7 people on board, while Christa McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, the woman that President Reagan had so determined to put in space, a teacher as the first civilian, the other people, just very quickly, before we go to the White House, to tell you their names again: Francis Dick Scobie, who was the commander; Michael Smith; Judith Resnick, who's flown, of course, in space before; Ronald McNair; Allison Onizuka; Gregory Jarvis; and, of course, Christa McAuliffe, on whom, for this mission at least, the nation had focused, as we'd focused on Senator Garn when he became the first politician in space. ABC Sam Donaldson is standing by now at the White House. Sam, I shared with you over there this morning the incredible sense of shock in the White House when the news was announced. What's happened subsequently?
Well, Peter, just a few minutes ago, the President came into the room in which a group of us were being briefed on his State of the Union message. He said it was a great tragedy and just a horrible thing that had happened. He recounted how they came in and told him, and he went and watched the television. He says, our hearts go out to all of the families involved. But under questioning, Mr. Reagan said the space program will go on. Of course, he said at the moment, he wants to make certain before any more shuttles are attempted in the launching sense that it is safe. He doesn't know any of the details, but he says he has confidence in the space program and the people who administer it. And the President pointed out, rather philosophically, again in response to questions, that we have had accidents in all forms of transportation in the past, and we don't give up on the transportation. In fact, his exact words were, well, when something like this happens, it's a horrible thing, but we don't back up and quit. So he made very clear that he expects the space program to go on, Peter, but not until there's been a complete investigation and people can determine what's happened and make certain that it doesn't happen again.
I would think, Sam, that in terms of the Washington political structure, the president's really speaking for everybody and perhaps for much of the country that the program is now mature enough, even with the loss of 7 lives, which is very sad, to go on exploring the skies.
Well, that's true. Mr. Reagan pointed out that this is the first accident in which a fatality has been involved in the entire space program, except, of course, for Gus Grissom and the others who died on the pad in the early days of space exploration by the United States down in Florida. But we've launched all of these flights, all of these shuttle flights, and they've gone off with no loss of life. He said that this program has to go on, and someone said, well, what would you say to the students who are waiting there, Mrs. McAuliffe's students? And he said, I'd try to explain to them that when these horrible things happen, you just have to, and that's where he used the phrase, you just can't quit. You can't back up and quit. You have to go on.
In a nation that is so internationally renowned for our sense of exploration, Sam, I'm surely that's an answer that students would be satisfied with. What about the State of the Union tonight? The President is going to talk about the family, he's going to talk about the economy. Is it going to be a different speech now?
Well, the State of the Union speech will be held tonight at 9 o'clock at the regular time. Mr. Reagan had a reference in his speech already about the space flight. Of course, that reference has been deleted, and he's going to insert a new one. He will clearly begin with an expression of sorrow and sadness about what has happened today. What words he'll use, I don't know. I think they don't know at the moment. They're trying to discover exactly what they want to say about it. Then he'll go on with his regular speech. We asked him whether this wouldn't necessarily cast a pall over that speech, and he agreed it would, because clearly he was going to give a speech which was upbeat. He'd intended to say the State of the Union is good, things are very good, we're going to go forward. And tonight he can't really give that kind of speech without first talking about something that's happened that's very bad.
Sam, thank you very much. Sam Donaldson at the White House, where he and the President are preparing for, or were preparing, I should say, for the State of the Union message tonight, which is why all of us were over there. And now, of course, very much distracted by this tragedy in space, 7 Americans on board the Space Shuttle Challenger. One, by the way, of 4 shuttles which presently exist. Columbia and Challenger are the 2 we have become most familiar with. Discovery and Atlantis, the other 2, which are available to be used in space by, as we said earlier this morning, a wide variety of people who want to conduct experiments in space, everything from the American military to international industry to the launching of satellites. So at the risk of being too certain about anything, I don't think there's much doubt in anybody's mind, at least in this capital city, that the space program will, of course, go on apace after a suitable investigation of what has happened. We have talked, by the way, before we go, Steve Bell, who's done yeoman work here this morning, from very early this morning, has now gone off to prepare another program, and I thank him very much for coming and joining us and letting us join him. Gene Cernan, the Apollo astronaut, who's been something of an editorial advisor to us on space, is still standing by at the end of a telephone. Gene, this sense of going forward, that surely is one that's felt in the space community.
Peter, do you hear me okay?
I do indeed.
Yeah, there'll be a great deal of reaction, and I certainly believe overreaction, but, you know, the space program has become a part of our lives. Whether we like to believe it or accept it or not, it is indeed a part of our life, and it's a part of our future, and it will go forward. Obviously, there's going to be, as I say, a lot of overreaction. We'll take a look at this problem. We'll find out what it was. We'll solve it. We'll eliminate it for the future, and I think there's no question about the fact that we'll go forward. I heard Jake Garn, and I certainly endorse everything he said, and you know, he talked about safety and NASA being conservative. It was just a couple days ago I had a discussion with some of my colleagues about that very conservatism, and we both agreed, or we all agreed at that time, that, you know, for the space shuttle to be truly operational, we can't let a few clouds bother us. We can't let a few ice crystals bother us. We got to reduce or remove some of that conservatism. It's sort of a paradox because of all that conservatism that something like this should come up to bite us. I don't think that there's any question, but if there's any criticism anyone can ever make of NASA, is that the fact that at times they tended to be almost too careful.
Gene, I know you can now see a television set where you are at the moment. Forgive me, but where are you?
Well, I'm in my office. It's the closest
Houston.
place I could get to be in contact with you, and I am watching on television at this point in time, so I have seen the sequences of the flight.
Gene, then if you wouldn't mind, we're going to look again at the accident as it occurred and ask you to give us the benefit of your knowledge as to what you see, not necessarily what you think might have happened. This is very slow motion, Gene.
Well, Peter, unfortunately, I'm going to do, but I just got cut off from your local affiliate here, so I think I've seen it enough. You'll have to keep me in tune of where we are, though, and I'll try and tell you what I do remember and what I do.
The explosion is just occurring, Gene.
Pardon, the explosion is just occurring. As I looked at it, you could it almost appears as if the explosion is occurring somewhere near the aft or the back end of the shuttle end or that external tank. It also appears to me, and again, far be it for me to speculate and try and be an expert at this point in time. It's going to take weeks and months to figure this one out. But it appears as if some explosion occurred at the aft end of the vehicle or aft end of the external tank, which, as we recall, carries the explosive fuel of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, and then worked its way forward, extremely quickly consuming the shuttle itself, as we also could have seen that the solid rocket boosters themselves looked like they were blowing away and indeed continued to burn as they normally would, only without guidance or without control at this point in time.
So, Gene, the heat shields, for example, on board the shuttle itself, which are designed for re-entry, absolutely no use whatsoever?
No, that is to control predetermined heat that the shuttle has to dissipate during re-entry, and that's a very critical phase in itself, but because the shuttle is a very flyable and maneuverable vehicle, the rate at which the shuttle absorbs that heat through its heat shield can be controlled. In this particular case, that explosion occurred in a matter of seconds, or certainly microseconds, and I had heard discussion about escape capsules and ejection seats. Being a pilot, being a test pilot, having flown aircraft and even spacecraft under similar circumstances, and indeed we had ejection seats way back on the Gemini space program. There were times that we knew that no matter what escape mechanism we had, we would not have been able to react quick enough, at least under circumstances which I just saw here this morning, to be able to use those escape mechanisms.
So, Gene, you wholeheartedly, I gather, agree with Senator Garn this morning that even if there had been an escape capsule on board, it wouldn't have done any good, based on what you've seen?
Based upon what I see, it almost looks like the Challenger was consumed almost immediately by the explosive propellants which were in that external tank, and an escape capsule certainly at best would have been marginally effective in this case. And whether we like to believe it or not, we've gone forward over the years and the centuries in the development of man, and certainly the development of this country, where in order to get where we wanted to go, there were certain risks we had to take. Obviously, this was one of those. Again, I want to emphasize, I happen to believe that space and space exploration is certainly here to stay. We will recoup as a nation, and I think we will move forward. But we will move forward, I think, just a little bit wiser, a little bit smarter, with a little bit more capability. If I might, Peter, I'm close to those crew members. They're the new kids on the block, if you will, but I've known them all, and I guess I feel especially close to this one because I happen to be on the selection board, the panel that selected Christa McAuliffe to fly in space.
Gene, thank you very much for a very thoughtful contribution to us this morning. We would be very grateful if you would stand by, because we are waiting to hear some reports from Mission Control in Houston. But ABC's Lynn Scherr, who has covered the space program for us, I won't say longer, but certainly more vigorously, Lynn, than anybody else, and with enormous intelligence and grasp. You knew these people very well on a human basis. Senator Garn said something this morning that was terribly interesting. He said everybody has the feeling that the program is so safe. Is there an anxiety level for people?
Not really, Peter. It's quite amazing that these astronauts go about their jobs. They climb into the craft, they go up into space, and they don't really think about the dangers, certainly not on a regular basis. Keep in mind that this crew is comprised mostly of professional flyers. Dick Scobie, Mike Smith, Ellison Onizuka, Ron McNair. These guys have been pilots for most of their lives. Judy Resnick, an electrical engineer who was, of course, part of that new group of astronauts who came in, the mission specialists, the scientists. And they were not used to this, the flying, the anxiety, any of that kind of thing. But they entered the space program because they wanted to go, they wanted to do it. And I don't think that they thought about the danger. Christa McAuliffe, of course, I'm reminded about the comment that I know our viewers have seen and heard from her principal, that she was not afraid of life. She liked new challenges, and that's why she wanted to go. And Greg Jarvis, part of another new class of Space Shuttle passengers, participants, a payload specialist, he was there because Hughes Aircraft had an experiment and he was going to be working it for them. I should point out to you also, Peter, that I'm out here in Los Angeles because I've been covering a far more joyous mission, which is the flight of Voyager 2 past the planet Uranus. And as a matter of fact, you talk about the routineness of the space shuttle flight. Most of the reporters who regularly cover the space shuttle missions are out here because the space shuttle has had, in fact, become so routine that the Voyager mission was, in a way, far more unique.
Lynn,
so it's been a great shock.
Please stand by for just a second. I just want to do a little bit of reporting here that Rockwell International, which is the shuttle manufacturers, had no comment yet on this. There is going to be a news conference given by the space agency, NASA, at 3 o'clock. It'll be held at Cape Canaveral. John Glenn, who is certainly one of this nation's most famous men in space, is going to have something to say about 145. Lynn was going on a little bit there about the people who had flown. Then let me ask you about the three who had not flown before. They're Mike Smith, Greg Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe. Do they go easily into this or not?
Oh, sure. They wouldn't be there if they couldn't adapt well. And, Peter, if I can just backtrack for 1 minute, I realize that Rockwell has not had an official comment. We have spoken to them out here in California. As you know, Rockwell, the company that built the shuttle, apparently the mood out at their plant, total dismay, shock. It's like a morgue out there. A sensation that I know is shared at a lot of companies, homes, offices around this country right now. But on that other issue, the astronauts get to, well, let's put it this way, the people get to Houston, they become astronauts, and they just get into that way of life. They are in trainers for a good deal of their time. They're flying in T-38s, which are those very small training, high-powered jet aircraft. They don't fly them if they're not the pilots, but they're in the back seat. They have oxygen masks on, they have pressure suits. They are used to the kind of danger that professional pilots go through on a regular basis. And they are not doing it necessarily because they want the danger, but they're doing it because they want to go into space and they want to do a job. And I think the danger is very far down the line.
Lynn, explain, if you would, a detail to me. We were listening, as you know, to the, and I've just had the transcript of the final communications between Challenger and Mission Control. We hear absolutely nothing after we hear the Mission Control commander say, throttle up. And he goes right on talking, even though the explosions occurred. Why might that be?
Well, for one thing, they have said they saw no anomalies whatsoever in the solid rocket boosters, in the engine performance, or in the shuttle itself. What they are doing, Peter, keep in mind, is not looking out the window. They are not watching the shuttle lift off the way the spectators are and the way we are on television. They are looking at screens. They're looking at monitors. They're looking at printouts. And they're reading their numbers. And their numbers did not tell them what, in fact, had happened.
And it sounds very much like, Lynn, given the speed with which everything happened, that the crew never knew what happened either.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think Gene is quite right. It happened so quickly. Those poor people did not have a prayer. They had no chance. And I think it was over very quickly.
Lynn, let me ask you the same question that I heard somebody on the Hill ask Senator Garn. He said he would fly again tomorrow if NASA would let him. And you, I know, have applied to be the first journalist in space. Give you any second thoughts?
Of course I have second thoughts. By the same token, I think that it is the spirit of people who keep on going after accidents, after they're cleared up, after the reasons are understood, that has made this country wonderful. I think that if the first pioneers gave up when the first covered wagons were attacked, the West never would have been settled. I think that if the first astronauts had looked at those first rockets that blew up on the pad, without humans in them, of course, they might never have gone. We wouldn't have had a space program. There are some very brave people who have kept this country going and have kept us preeminent in technology. Sure, I have second thoughts, but I want to wait and see what NASA figures out and what they do about it.
Okay, Lynn, if you wouldn't mind standing by, we may have some further indication of what is going on because the acting administrator of NASA has gone to the White House clearly to report to President Reagan, to the Vice President, and the White House staff, and there is going to be a NASA news conference at 3 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time, which of course ABC News will cover live. It is now, I see now, past another half hour, at least here in the East. So for those of you who may in fact be watching television for the first time today, we're going to show you again from launch the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning from Cape Canaveral in Florida, 11:39 a.m. Eastern Time this morning.
Heading downrange.
Those are the big, solid fuel booster rockets, the white ones we've so accustomed to seeing on the outside. At some point, they are destined, of course, to break away as they drive the Space Shuttle Challenger closer to its orbit. That great, big cigar-like thing you see underneath Challenger is an enormous tank of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, the main tank.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Just under 2,000 miles an hour.
Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Go with throttle up. Take the extra boost to go for orbit.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And there you see it, about 2 minutes and 10 seconds after the flight began at Cape Canaveral this morning. That which you see flaming off into the distance is one of the external tanks, the solid fuel rockets going off on its own. Those great, enormous tanks which give the shuttle its initial early boost are designed to be recoverable. They are made of heavy steel and drop into the Atlantic Ocean for recovery and reuse.
Here looking very carefully at the situation.
This is a videotape you're watching.
Major malfunction. We have no downlink.
No downlink, no communications, in other words, between mission control and the shuttle. 11:39 this morning Eastern Time in those jet blue skies over the Atlantic as debris falls towards the Atlantic some 10 to 18 miles from Cape Canaveral itself, because it wasn't, of course, going straight up, but downrange as well. And rescue crews and contingency rescue teams, as they call them, have now gone out into the Atlantic. Had to wait for almost an hour.
From the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.